I don't know if he's talking already.
Hi, Eve Wexford.
Where's the host?
I'm right here. We're just going to wait a few minutes until everyone gets in. Okay. So just another few minutes until we get started. I appreciate everyone's patience.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi there. Nice to see you.
You were distance apart, but not really.
Amen. Let's hope. Thank you.
Rabbi Feinstein.
Hello.
Hello. It's Louise Spitzer. Could you do me a huge favor?
Yes, dear.
Could you ask Rafi to call me? There was one thing I didn't tell him.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Thank
We're just going to wait another moment till everyone gets on so we don't get interrupted while we begin. Okay. Thank you for your patience. Well, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see everyone again. I hope you're taking very good care. Pesach is in about 9-10 days, and that means it's a very special time of year for us all. So I'm really delighted that we're able to be together and continue our conversation about the questions that won't go away. Tonight we'll do what we did last week. We'll learn for about 45 minutes, and then I'll stop. And if anyone would like to ask questions or open a discussion, I'd be happy to do that with you as we share these kind of questions. These are very personal issues and very deep issues. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to carry out a conversation in this format by Zoom and with so many folks, but we'll do the very best we can to be able to have an opportunity to share some ideas and some thinking. This is going to be a very important event. It's going to happen sometime in the next decade. And I'm very sure that it's not going to receive any news coverage whatsoever. It's going to pass by very quietly, but it is a very profound moment. Sometime in the next decade, the last of the survivors is going to leave us. The last person who witnessed the Holocaust and all of its horrors as an adult is going to depart from our midst. If you think about the mathematics, if a person was 20 years old in 1945, they're late into their 90s by now. And that means that the last person who can testify to what happened in the horrors of the Shoah will no longer be walking among us, no longer able to tell their story. There are very, very few, or even now, who can tell their stories coherently and cogently. When that happens, something remarkable will happen to that event. That event will slip from memory to history. Now consider that for just a minute. When an event is a memory, when there are eyewitnesses, participants still walking among us, we can ask them, what did you see? What did you hear? What happened? And they can tell us their story. And we defer to them. We defer to their story, even though eyewitness testimony sometimes isn't very accurate. And there's a whole bunch of evidence for that. And sometimes we recognize that when someone remembers something, especially something that happened a very long time ago, they construct a memory they put pieces together as a memory. So we understand that that's what happens. We understand that that's how memory works, but still we defer to their memories because memory is largely autonomic. It's what we saw, what we heard, and what we were able to share. And when that last survivor, when the last eyewitness, when the last participant leaves us, then we're left with history. And history is a very different process than memory. History is constructed. It is an intentional process. First of all, it's selective. When you think about something as gargantuan as the Shoah, as the Holocaust, you think about how many the infinite number of discrete events makes up that historic event. A historian who tells the story is going to have to select among them and decide which ones are significant and which ones are not. The historian will frame them and say, let's pay attention to this one and not to that one. The historian will draw meaning out of that. Ask the question, why did it happen? What were the causes of this event? And what were the implications of this event? And ultimately ask the question, what's the meaning of this event? And that's going to yield a very different kind of account than we get from an eyewitness. The historian, the person who does history, who creates history, is going to be using the event to teach an idea, a moral idea about how we behave in the world and what we can learn and what this event comes to teach us and what light it sheds upon our own circumstances now. That's why they do history. It's a constructed account, not simply an account of what I saw and what I experienced. So when it comes to the Shoah, we're going to ask the question, what happened? Now, we know that at the end, 11 million human beings, 6 million Jews, including 1 million Jewish children, were destroyed, were murdered. But by whom? And for what purposes? And what meaning can we draw out of that event? I mean, by whom? Could we say, for example, that a great European civilization was hijacked by a madman and his band of co-conspirators, and they forced that great German civilization to do something frightfully evil? That's one way to tell the story. Or we could say that the Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, and only the last and most brutal chapter of what Christian anti-Semitism had been threatening to do for generations and generations. Or should we say that the Holocaust is an expression of the world's eternal and perennial Jew hatred? There's an old Israeli song that has the words, Kol ha'olam negdenu. The whole world is against us. And is that what the Holocaust was? And of course, you understand that depending on which of those stories we choose to tell, we change the moral universe for our children and our grandchildren. If you say that this was a madman who took over a normally civilized people and turned them into moral barbarians, that's a very different idea than to say an entire civilization decided to do this or an entire world decided to do this. It even comes down to the question, can you trust the people who live across the street or next door? Can you trust them? I mean, my grandfather used to take me by the hand when we would walk. He would walk in front of a church. He'd pull me across the street, because he was of that generation that believed that no one Christian could be trusted. Me, I have friends who are Christian. I have friends who are Christian clergy. We have a very different world that we live in. But depending on how you tell the story determines the moral truth of what we're going to teach. And even more so, depending on what story we tell and what moral we draw and what meaning we draw, well, that's going to determine how our children walk the world and what they're willing to trust, who they're willing to trust, and what they're willing to trust, and what they're willing to believe in, and who we see as allies and who we see as adversaries in our work in the world. You can see how the different ways we tell the story change the world that we live in. And that's what history always is. It is a deliberate construction. It is a deliberate construction based on it is a deliberate construction based on a moral truth that we wish to convey to the world. Now, this isn't just with the Shoah, of course. Right now in the United States, there is a very, very virulent conversation going on about how to tell the story about our history, about American history. When I was a little kid going to school, I learned, I'm sure most of you learned, that Columbus discovered America. Remember, and October 12th was Columbus Day, and we would have a little celebration. Columbus discovered America. We tell the story about how Christopher Columbus maintained that the world was round, and that he could sail to India by going west instead of going east, and he could find the short route to India. And he went to the grandees of Genoa, who was his hometown, and they wouldn't accept him. So he went all over Europe and finally landed in the court of Ferdinand and Isabel, who were willing to finance the journey. And the Pinta and the Santa Maria took off, and they went and they bumped into a continent they didn't know was there. And he saw peoples there, and he thought that he'd made it to India, so he called them Indians. Well, that's the way they taught us that story. And what a glorious thing it was that Columbus discovered America and the new world was open. But subsequent history now constructs it very differently. First of all, how can you say that he discovered America if there are people already living here? And there are people living here for thousands of years, and they'd constructed their own culture and their own civilization. And was it really a good thing that he came? Because he brought, smallpox and all sorts of horrible things to here that the peoples here weren't ready for. No one ever told us that story from the point of view of the first peoples, the natives, which would have been a very different story if you told it that way. And so it is that in America right now, there's a real opening up of this question of how do you tell the American story? Is the American story a story of the pursuit of freedom, the opening of liberty, the sharing of justice? Is that the American story? Or is the American story the story of the dispossession of the first peoples and the subjugation of people of color? That an economy was built on the backs of black slaves stolen from Africa, kidnapped and dehumanized and objectified and murdered. Is that the story that we wish to tell? Which American story are we going to tell? And the differences between those stories, between America as a land opening liberty to so many and America as a land built on the back of black slaves, is a very different story. We never learned American history through the eyes of women. It was only white men, white landowning men, frankly. And so there's a question of how you tell a story. And when it comes to the Shoah, that's a very powerful question for us right now. This week, we're going to prepare for Passover. And I want you to recognize that Pesach, Passover, is a story, but it's not a memory. Maybe at first it was. Maybe the early telling of the story of the Passover in the Bible was a memory. We were there. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. We heard Moses speak. We packed up our things. We rushed out of there without time to let the matzah rise, and we crossed the Red Sea. But the story we tell is not a memory, it's a history. It was created 1,500 years after the Exodus by the rabbis. Living under brutal Roman domination, they constructed the tale, and they constructed it in a very deliberate way. If you ever notice on your Seder plate, there aren't 5 portions of bitterness, only 1. And you never just eat the maror straight, you eat it tempered by the sweetness of haroset. Because the rabbis who told the story of our Pesach, the rabbis who told the story of our Passover constructed a story with a very deliberate moral, a very deliberate moral truth at its heart. They were trying to maintain and sustain and inspire hope. They wanted to say to us that there's always hope. They were living in a moment of brutal darkness. The Romans had destroyed the Holy Temple of Jerusalem. The Romans were crushing the people of Israel. There was a mass exodus out of the land of Israel toward Babylon and other places. And the rabbis who were left, the rabbis who created our tradition, our Seder tradition, it's quoted in the Mishnah, were very deliberately trying to tell a story whose moral was, no matter how bad it is, we're always on the verge of redemption. No matter how difficult times are, no matter how brutal the Pharaoh of this particular moment, this particular generation might be, there will be a redemption. We will cross the Red Sea and we will arrive at the other side. And when we arrive at the other side, we will sing a song of our redemption. That is the deep moral truth of our Pesach. Now think about that for a minute. It's not the story of enslavement, of oppression, of persecution, of dehumanization, of brokenness. It's a story of liberation, a story of release, a story of joy, celebration. That's a remarkable way to tell the story. There were, after all, many more generations of slaves than there were liberated people. And you could have told the story in a very different way, but the rabbis chose to emphasize not the enslavement and the oppression, but to emphasize the liberation and the freedom. That's what we celebrate in the Passover, because they wanted to tell a story with a moral. And the moral of that story is hope. And the moral of that story is a certain way to look at the world. Because you were a slave in Egypt, because I was a slave in Egypt, I bear a certain empathy for the stranger, the widow, the orphan, the dispossessed, the disempowered, the needy among us. Because I experienced social invisibility, because I was erased from the world as a slave was erased, I never allow any human being to walk the world and be erased. I accept upon myself responsibility to construct a society that is the diametric opposite of the Egypt that we experienced, the diametric opposite of a society that is dehumanized, a society that objectifies human beings, owns them, works them to death. I will not allow that to exist in the society that I have a participatory role in. That's a remarkable ideal. And that ideal, I think, stands for something very precious to us. That's how we tell our story. And then finally, there's a whole theory of history that grows out of this. I mean, think for just a moment about that moment of the Red Sea. If you didn't read the book, you certainly saw the movie. We were slaves. Our parents were slaves. Our grandparents were slaves. Their parents were slaves. We had no hope. We had no hope except to continue to be slaves. Maybe our children would have it a little easier than we did. Shows up this fellow Moses and says, pack your things, we're leaving tomorrow. We didn't believe him. According to the Midrash, only a fifth of us, only 20% believed him. The others stayed behind. We're the ones who left. And we watched the plagues come and crush Pharaoh, but we saw Pharaoh rebound each time and become even more recalcitrant, more intransigent, more stubborn each time, his heart hardening each time. And finally, the last of the 10 plagues. The last of the 10 plagues come. And Pharaoh says, get out of my land. I want nothing more of you. And we ran so fast. The idea that we didn't have time to let the bread rise. We ran to get out of that country. And we ended up at the shore of the Red Sea. And we thought maybe we'd be free. Maybe we'd be free. Maybe this is the beginning of our freedom. And then Pharaoh changed his mind the last time. And we heard him coming down the mountain. And we saw death coming behind us. And at that moment, we confronted Moses and said, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness? It's something about Jews, by the way. No matter how bad things are, no matter how much hurried we are, there's always time for a good kvetch. And when we kvetch, do we kvetch? We are such good kvetchers. My God, we become so articulate, so fluent when we want to kvetch. I mean, what a soliloquy. Death is coming, but we got time for a kvetch. Moses says, watch, just shut up and watch. He holds his arm above the sea and the sea splits and we ran through the sea. We got to the other side. He holds his arm again and Pharaoh's armies are drowned. And then we turned around and we looked out at the vast expanse of the wilderness in front of us, and we took one big, deep breath. And we said, now we know we're free. V'chamocha ba'elim Adonai. We sang this song of freedom. That's such a remarkable scene. Now think of that scene for a moment. Think about the beginning for a moment. Think about Genesis. Genesis begins, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and the earth was unformed and void. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. There's nothing in the world. It's mishmash. The Hebrew word is tohu vavohu. Mishmash. It's all uncreated, chaotic stuff. And yet, the Bible's symbol for uncreated world is water. There's water. And God's ruach, God's spirit, hovers over the water. Hovers over the water. Water. Water represents chaos. If you ever had a roof leak and you had to have somebody come and fix it, and the guy says, well, it's coming in over here, but it's getting up, you know why water is a symbol of chaos. Because it really is something you can't control. So history, so at the beginning, cosmos begins in water. And God, what does God do on the second day of creation? First day is light and darkness. Second day, God creates an opening in the water and opens up dry land in the water. Water is chaos, and dry land represents cosmos, ordered nature. Cosmos is ordered nature. Cosmos is the opportunity to live in a world that is orderly. This is natural order. We live in a world of nature. Nature has patterns. We call them natural laws, but they're not laws. They're just patterns. Gravity is one of those patterns. You can count on it. There are no exceptions to gravity. There are no exceptions to the natural order. And that's why we can count on it. That's why we can do science, because as we study nature, we can learn how to control it because its orderly patterns are consistent all the time. That's what it takes to live in a world. Imagine what the world would be like if gravity worked 80% of the time. I mean, if 20% of the time objects fell up instead of falling down, you couldn't live in such a world. You wouldn't know how to navigate such a world. But laws of inertia, laws of entropy, laws of gravity, all of the natural laws as they were, are consistent. And that gives us the opportunity to live in a controlled reality that we can predict. Well, what does it mean then that the waters of the Red Sea split? It means that that is the beginning, not of cosmos, but of history. Slavery represents the chaos of history. Human beings who own one another, human beings who objectify, dehumanize, delegitimize one another. History opens up when the waters split. Now we can see history, and history, according to the Torah, has a moral order. What is history? It is a journey. That's the metaphor. It is a journey from the house of bondage to the promised land, from Egypt to Canaan, from slavery to freedom, from depredation to opportunity. That's what history is about. It's a journey, and because we know where we're going and what we're aiming at redemption. We can tell if we're making a step forward or a step backward. We can talk about progress in history and regress in history because we have a sense of where we're going and what we're trying to achieve in history. That's what the symbol of the Red Sea constitutes. That's what this whole story is really about. It's a journey to a promised land, a journey toward redemption. And that structures our understanding of history. Now, someone at your Seder table next Saturday night is going to ask you this question. This is the question we've come tonight to answer. Did it happen? Did it happen? Were Jews slaves in Egypt? Was there a Pharaoh? Was there a Moses? Did the sea really split? Did we walk into dry land? Did we end up on the other side? Did it happen? Did it happen? I don't know. Unfortunately, there's no videotape. They lost the videotape. Sorry. There's no videotape. But frankly, even if there was videotape, I'm not sure that would help us very much. Because the way we tell the story is that the facts of the story are not really the point. Actually, if you read the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, and you read it very carefully, it's in the 15th chapter of Exodus, you'll see that there are really two stories fused together. One is the story that you saw in the movie, giant walls of water on both sides. The other says the wind blew all night, and then in the morning, Moses took a cross. And then when Pharaoh came chasing us, the wheels of his chariots got stuck in the mud. It was a swamp. And he knew how to get through it. He knew where the rocks were that you could walk on without getting stuck in the swamp. And you can't chase escaped slaves to a swamp on a chariot. And that's what happened. Not nearly as dramatic, but it's a more natural story. But even that's not the point. The facts of the story are not the point. The point of the story is to teach us a way to understand ourselves in the world, who we are, what's expected of us, how we see ourselves, how we see our tasks in the world, how we understand the world about us, and answering some of the fundamental questions. Is there hope? Is there hope for us as a species? Is there hope for us as a people? Is there hope for us individually and collectively? Is there hope? What am I expected to do when I walk through the world, through the streets of this city? What do I see when I see other people? These moral questions are the real questions that Torah is coming to answer. Modern historians have worked very hard to create a canon, a whole set of protocols about how they test facts. And even they can't ultimately test all the facts. Ancient historians were simply not interested in this because they weren't interested in simply telling you what happened. They were interested in telling you what you can learn from what happened. They wanted to know what you can learn from what happened, right? The chances that there were 2.5 million Israelite slaves in Egypt 3,000 years ago, we know that there were Canaanites, and we would be included in that number, who were enslaved by the Egyptians. We do have archaeological evidence that there were Canaanites who were conquered and enslaved by the Egyptians. How many there were, how self-conscious they were of being Israelites, all of that came late. We don't know any of that. We don't know how they got out. We don't know if there was a Moses or if there was some other escape, another method of escape. Because the Torah's purpose is not to convey the facts of what happened. The facts are sort of pretext, not text. The purpose of the story is to answer some much deeper questions. Who am I? Where am I in the world? What is my life about? Can I hope? Do I have any hope? That's what the story is about. And that's why that's what the writers of the story were most interested in. That's why we have multiple versions of the stories. That's why we have parts of the story which didn't happen. They didn't happen. Look, I teach kids all the time, and I love teaching kids. And I have a game that I play with the kids. I actually play this game with the kids. Ask me any question you want, And I do this with the kids in the morning when I do morning minyan. And one of the kids will raise his hand and say, Rabbi, we study Genesis. Good. We study the story of Adam and Eve. Great. Rabbi, if Adam and Eve only had 2 kids and they were both boys, how did the world get full of people? Smart kid. What's he really asking? What is she really asking? Really asking me if I come across something in Torah, which I know can't be true. What am I supposed to do with that? Am I supposed to say Torah is true no matter what, even though it violates my common sense? Or am I supposed to say, I know better? So I say to the kid, do you think the people who wrote the Torah were foolish, were stupid? He said, no, of course not. They were the wisest people who ever were. I say, don't you think that question must have occurred to them? Do you think the people who wrote the Torah ever saw a burning bush, a talking snake, a splitting sea? Do you think they lived in a world whose natural law was so completely different than ours? Do you think they ever saw talking donkeys? Do you think they ever saw that stuff? Of course not. They live in the same world you live in, the same world I live in. In fact, they had many fewer miracles than you and I have, right? I got vaccinated a couple of weeks ago. You don't think I would talk about a miracle? They didn't have vaccinations. They just had to wait till the damn plague passed by. So I say to the kid, do you think that they were stupid? And he says, no. And I said, well, don't you think the question occurred to them? And he said, it must have. I said, then what do you think? He said, they must be trying to tell me something else. Exactly. Exactly right. So let's go back over the story again. If all of humanity comes from the same mom and dad, what does that make us? That makes us family. Now you have to be careful how you ask the next question. How are you supposed to treat your family? And the kid says, treat them with care and responsibility. We welcome our family. It's exactly right. And understand what that's saying. Who is your family? Who is your family? Just people who look like us, pray like us, eat like us, smell like us? No, everybody. People who live across the street, who worship differently, people who live up the block, who look different than us, people who eat different foods and have different attitudes about the world. And yet, Torah starts out by telling you we're all one family. We're all responsible for each other. We're all in this together. We all share one very small, vulnerable planet. Now, how are you going to behave? You see what the story's trying to do? Yeah, sometimes I'm sure the facts of the story were true. There were Canaanite slaves and captured by the Egyptians who built pyramids or whatever they built in Egypt. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to talk to me how I understand my own history and my own experience. And that's the question. It's at that level that we have to ask the question, is the Torah true? Are its facts true? I don't know. I don't know. And by the way, if you think that's so strange, let me ask you a different question just to consider for just a moment. You ready? On November 22nd, 1963, the most popular president this country had in generations was murdered on the busiest street in the seventh biggest city of the country, in front of thousands and thousands of spectators, in front of hundreds of law enforcement professionals, in front of thousands of journalists. On November 22nd, 1963, the president of the United States was murdered. We even have the video. We have the videotape. We have the film. Who killed him and why? And if you can't answer that question, how do you establish the facticity or non-facticity of accounts which are 3,000-4,000 years old? You see the problem? You see the problem? Facticity is not so easy. Look, hell, on January 6th, there was an insurrection, a riot, a something that happened at the United States Capitol, and we still quite haven't figured out what happened. Facticity isn't the truth of Torah. Yes, the facts may be there. No, the facts may not be there. That's not the point of the story. It's the moral of the story that matters. And that we need to debate. Because even there's a debate. Because you can ask the question that my brother perennially asks me at the Seder. How come all these Egyptians had to suffer so we could get out of Egypt? Why couldn't God have taken us out with a more specific strike? Why do you have to destroy all the firstborn of Egypt? That's a very powerful question, by the way. I like that question a lot, because then he's asking me a question I can answer. Because then we can say, okay, we're not going to talk about the facticity, the factual truth of the story. I want to talk about the moral truth of the story. And you want to know something? The moral truth of the story is something we can debate. And I'll tell you why we can debate it. Many Jews believe that God gave us the words of Torah. Kids will ask me this all the time also. Did God write the Torah? And I'll say, oh, yes. I do believe that, by the way. God did write the Torah. No question. Only one thing. God doesn't own a pencil or a pen or a word processor. How did God write the words of Torah? What did God use as an instrument to write down the words of Torah? God used the sensitive, thinking, reflective, thoughtful souls of human individuals through history. And those human individuals, they conveyed what they understood to be the word of God, but they speak languages, and languages are cultural creations. They lived in history, they lived in culture, and it is inevitable that when you live in history and when you live in culture, you bring your own biases and your own idiom, your own way of speaking to express that truth. And so the Torah is a combination. It is a meeting point between God and humanity. It is a combination of God's word and our words, God's truth and in our words. And because it's in our words, it's going to include all of the biases, all of the prejudices, and all of the cultural idioms of any particular historical moment. I was talking to my kids and I said to my kids, I said something and then I said it a second time and then I said the same thing a third time and I said, ugh, I feel like a broken record. And my son looked at me and said, what's that? Oh God, I'm sorry. Before there were podcasts and MP3s, before there were CDs, before there were cassettes, before there was reel to reel, there were these vinyl things called records. And you played them on a record player. And if your record was scratched or your needle wasn't good, you played anyway. You get the point. We all use these words because they're part of our idiom. If you want to make a phone call, what's the verb? You dial a number. How long has it been since there have been any dials on phones in this country? And yet we still use the word dial this number, right? We use idioms in ways. So our ancestors, when they wrote down the truth that they had gained from their experience in the world and they had heard God tell them, they wrote it down in their own idiom. And they wrote it down with their own biases and their own prejudices and their own ways of talking. And that's why you're going to find stuff in Torah, which is disturbing because it reflects chauvinism, nationalism, white supremacy even, right? Male chauvinism, certainly sexism, exclusion of women. It's going to include all kinds of things that I don't like in Torah. And yet, what do? I have to be an intelligent reader. I have to be a discriminating reader. I have to be an alive reader. I have to read it very carefully because I have to separate what is the word of God, the word of truth, from all of that cultural stuff that might not be appropriate anymore. And that means that you can never read simply passively. You and I, as a reader of Torah, as we are a reader of any text, are a constructor of truth, a builder of truth. We have to go through it and find the truth and embrace the truth. But we also have to be able to say, that's a prejudice. That's a cultural, historical prejudice that shouldn't have been there. Now, how do you make that discrimination? It's simple, really. No, it's not simple. Sorry. It's complicated, but the principle is simple. The principle is that the Torah sets out its principles. If the Torah tells me that every human being is created in the image of God and therefore bears infinite preciousness, then when I read a section in Torah which says I'm allowed to keep a Canaanite slave forever, I say, wait a minute, no, that doesn't work. That violates the Torah's own principle that every human being has infinite preciousness. The slavery part was the culture. The preciousness of human beings was God's word to me. That kind of discriminating, careful reading of scripture is what's called upon every Jew to do. That's how we do it. That's how we do it. There's a very famous commentary to the Torah. It's a commentary by an 11th century rabbi named Rabbi Solomon ben Yitzchak, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, who's known by his initials Rashi. Rashi's commentary is considered the most popular, most powerful commentary on the Torah ever written, and it's still to this day basic Jewish education, Chumash with Rashi. And so Chumash with Rashi, if you read the very first comment of Rashi on the Torah, he says something very, very interesting. You see, the first line of the Torah, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That's really not what it says. That first word, Breshit, that word is in a grammatical form called the construct form. It really means in the beginning of the. And the next word is supposed to be a noun, like in the beginning of the world, the beginning of the creation of the world. But the next word in the Torah, as we have it pointed, is bara, is a verb, which means that the Torah begins with an egregious grammatical error, which for people like me that could never get grammar right is actually kind of comforting. It's nice to know that even God screws up occasionally. But that's not what Rashi said. Rashi says this is a signal to you, because you can't read the first word of Torah literally or passively or just saying what it says. You have to figure out what it's saying. And so his phrase is very beautiful. He says, Eina mikra hazeh omer ela darsheni. It's like this Torah calls out, interpret me. Come and interpret me. Construct a meaning out of me. Because you can't simply appropriate meaning passively. You have to be an active builder of the truth of the Torah. You have to come and be a partner in creating the truth of Torah. And therefore, you read that first word, and Rashi says could be a number of different things. It could be that you take the second word, and instead of reading it bara, you read it baro, you make it into a noun. That works. Or maybe you read it differently. In the beginning, by the way, is the word barishona. You just change the word. Just change the word. Well, that's what you got to do, because you can't get past the first word without becoming an active, intelligent, discriminating reader of text, of scripture. That's what we are called upon to do. And as modern people, we have even a more difficult situation. You see, our ancestors could believe what the Torah says when it says that God has an active role in creating history. We're all going to open our Haggadahs on Saturday night next, and we're going to read that story. Here is God active in history, right? Pharaoh hardens his heart, and what does God do? God brings holy hell on Egypt. 10 plagues. One morning he woke up in his bed and there were frogs on his nose and frogs on his head. The question is, can we believe that sort of thing? That's a hard thing to believe for moderns. First of all, because we don't read history that way. We talk about political and economic and social forces in history. And we don't think about mystical forces that are shaping human affairs. And second of all, because we live after the Holocaust. And the Holocaust made it very hard for Jews to believe in a God who lives in history and punishes evil kings. Because my God, if there ever was a time for God to rain holy hell on earth, it would have been Berlin in 1942. If there had ever been a time for God to bring plagues on the world, it would have been Berlin in 1942. And that didn't happen. At least it didn't happen in time. Maybe we could say that the Allies' armies coming to liberate Germany, liberate the concentration camps, but they didn't come in time. 6 million were murdered. 1 million children were murdered. So how do I believe in a God of history? And I hope somebody asks you that question on Saturday night. And I hope you open up a discussion, because it's a brilliant discussion. Because then the question is, well, then what do I understand when I understand my tradition telling me this? And I would suggest that you ask the people at your Seder table. In Genesis, we learned that God opened the waters and created cosmos. Cosmos means that the natural world is governed by a set of patterns, set of laws. Do you believe that history is governed by a set of patterns and laws? That the Red Sea split means that history has a moral order. Is there a moral order? Martin Luther King famously said that the arc of history bends toward justice. Does it? Can we believe that? Can we believe and have hope that redemption will come even if at the moment we see the world as messed up as it is? Can we believe that the aims and plans of good and well-meaning people seeking justice in the world will somehow have an echo, a resonance in this lifetime, in this world? Or are they simply spinning their wheels? Are they simply futile actions of people who dream but don't understand how the world's really put together? This question of, is there a moral order, is really what the Seder, I think what the Seder is about. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves. That's the question we have to confront on the night of the Seder. So to answer your question tonight, is the Torah true? The answer is yes, just not all the facts. Not all the facts are true. Sometimes the Torah tells us moral truths using a story way of telling a truth. And a story way bends and twists and turns the facts. But the real question about the truth of the Torah is whether the moral truth of the Torah is true. And I happen to believe that the moral truth of the Torah is not only true, it's necessary. It's something that all of us have much to learn from in this world, because the world hasn't yet even begun to catch up with the moral truth of our Torah. So let me stop there. I appreciate for everybody listening so much. I hope this will give you a little bit of help Let me make a couple of quick announcements before we open up this open up conversation. So tomorrow, next week, next Wednesday night, we're going to take a little hiatus, a little break from our discussion of the questions that won't go away, and we're going to do a session of Passover teaching, all about the Seder, the Haggadah, the secret meanings of the Seder, and lots of wonderful Pesach stuff, including a little Pesach music, some new Pesach music. So you're welcome to join us next week at 7 o'clock right here on Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, and join us for Passover learning, Yontif University, we call it. Then we're going to take a week off because it's Pesach and we all get liberated, even your rabbi. And in the beginning of April, the beginning of our of April, we're going to gather together. But in the first two sessions in April are going to be on Tuesday nights. So Tuesday night, the 6th of April, and Tuesday night, the 13th of April, we're going to meet Tuesday instead of Wednesday. Why, you ask? Because the 7th of April is Yom HaShoah, and we're going to do a very special commemoration in the synagogue through the synagogue for Yom HaShoah. So we'll be talking on the 6th of April of what we learned from the Holocaust. The question is, where was God, and how do you believe in a God after the Holocaust? And on the 13th, it's on the 14th is Yom HaAtzmaut. So the night before is Yom HaZikaron. We'll meet that night and we'll talk about what difference Israel makes. And then on the 21st and 28th, we'll return to Wednesday nights. So please mark your calendars appropriately. Tuesday nights, the 6th and 13th, and then the 21st and 28th. Okay? Thank you all for listening. Anyone who would like to ask a question, if you'll either raise your hand or put it in the chat box. And for those who like to stick around, we'll ask us some questions. And for those who need to leave and catch what's ever on TV tonight, we'll wish you a very pleasant evening. And thank you for being part of this. Mark Schneider, you want to begin? Go ahead. Mark, you there?
Yeah. Does God? Yeah.
You muted yourself again, sir. So please unmute yourself again. Please. You're muted.
Okay. Does God know the future if he is here in the present moment?
Does God know the future? Well, in the Bible, he doesn't, because in the Bible, he's constantly surprised by the dumb things human beings do. I mean, the God of the Bible resembles the parent of a teenager, right? Who's always surprised about either the good things or the bad things that kids do. So I can identify with the God of the Bible completely. You know, when Jews met the Greeks beginning in the 3rd century BC, and when we met the Greeks and we started to learn Greek philosophy, we applied the Greek standards of metaphysics to our understanding of God. And that's where you get a God who's outside of time and a God who is able to see the future and know the future, lives outside of time. And that's a beautiful idea. But, you know, that's a Greek idea. It's not a Jewish idea. It's not a Jewish idea. When kids ask me this, I mean, I don't mind. I'm sorry to keep referring to children, but I just find their questions so wonderful because they're the questions all of us want answers to, but they ask them in such a beautifully innocent way. So let me put it this way. Kid asks me, you know, if God created the world, who created God? It's a really wonderful question. Because what the kid's saying is, everything in the world has a beginning, Rabbi. Does God have a beginning? You know, and I'll say to the kid, can you think of something that doesn't have a beginning? You know, you had a beginning, you had a birthday, and I have a birthday. My car was manufactured on a certain day. And everything we know in the world has a beginning. Is there anything you can think of that doesn't have a beginning? And kids will think, and one of the kids will say, well, love. Love doesn't have a beginning. It's always been around. Time doesn't have a beginning. Einstein debated this, so I'm not going to get into relativity physics, but, you know, does time have a beginning? If time doesn't have a beginning, if time had a beginning, what was 5 minutes before? So I say, if time doesn't have a beginning, love, justice, these things don't have beginnings, what can we learn? That there are certain realities which are not physical. And non-material, not physical realities don't have beginnings. They are an always. Perhaps God is an always. If God is an always, then It's not that God has a beginning or an end. God's not in time the way we are. In the same way that time's not in time the way we are. Now that's a very difficult thing because eternity is a concept that no kid can grasp. It's not even a concept most of the grown-ups could grasp. But that's really what we're talking about there. So can I separate God from time and say God doesn't live in time? Maybe God lives in all of the many possibilities of the future, and we just have to choose which possibility we want to live in, which universe of possibilities we choose to live in. And that's another way to think about that issue. Okay, thanks, Mark. Len and Barb, you're up. You get to unmute and ask a question.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
I have two questions. I missed your discussion of the Garden of Eden, and I find the Garden of Eden to be really very provocative.
Yes.
The way I see it, in my humble way, I see it as the first time man had to make a choice and take the consequences of his choice. I wanted to ask you what you think of that perspective.
Yeah, look, the Garden of Eden, first of all, there's a verse at the end of the story. Okay, if you read the whole story, the first chapter, it's the second chapter of Genesis, third chapter of Genesis, actually. But after man is put into the garden and he's alone, and God, first of all, I think it's wonderful that God creates, that the first story after human creation in the second chapter is the story of love. Man is alone and God says, oops, shouldn't be alone. Lo tov heyot adam levado, shouldn't be alone. Better create him a helpmate, better create him a companion. Gives him all the animals. Man says, that's a really cute puppy dog. It's a really affectionate pussy cat. I really enjoy hanging out with the Bengal tiger, but I need something better. So God puts him to sleep and creates woman. And man wakes up, and the first thing man says publicly in the Torah is Zotapam. This time, God, you got it right. The first story in Torah is about love. Isn't that a nice idea? It's the first story. The first thing God does is create love. I like that. I think that's beautiful. And then there's a line at the end of that story that says, Al Cain. Therefore, now it's a male-centric story. I apologize for that. But it says, therefore, a man leaves his mother and father and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Therefore, Al Cain in Hebrew. What does that mean, therefore? When you put a therefore at the end of the story, what you're saying is you're arresting the narrative flow, and you're saying, let me give you the moral of the story. Well, if you're giving the moral of a story, you're not reading it as history. You're not reading it as fact. You're not reading it as science. It's a myth, capital M. Myth, capital M, doesn't mean fairy tale. Myth, capital M, means a truth told in the form of a story. And that story has many truths in it. One of them is the one that you mentioned. We make choices. And the moment we make choices, we're no longer living in God's innocence anymore. We're no longer living in the innocence of childhood. Then we have to learn to live with the consequences. That's one of the meanings of that story. Another meaning of that story is we all seek a companion with whom we could share life. Friendship, love, romance, that's all part of life. That's another meaning of that story. But there's many other meanings to that story. But the idea is that this is a story told in order to convey the most fundamental truths of being human. So every now and again, you read a newspaper article that some guy went off to look for he found the boards from Noah's Ark on some mountain in Asia Minor, or he's going to go look for the Garden of Eden. That's lovely. That's great. That's ridiculous. This story wasn't meant to be a place. It wasn't meant to be told in the past tense. The story is a myth, capital M, and myth, capital M, is told in the present tense. It's describing who and what we are. And who and what we are people who seek companionship, love. Who and what we are people who have to make choices in life and live with the terrifying consequences of our choices. Who and what we are people who are tempted. Who and what we are people who want to create our own reality. God created us in his image. God is the creator. We're creators. What's our greatest creation? Ourselves. Put us in paradise and tell us not to touch anything. We're not going to do it. We want to create ourselves. So that's why we eat of the fruit of that tree. It's a wonderful story, but it's a story that's a myth. It's supposed to be telling us all the truths of who and what we are. So thank you. That's a wonderful question. I got lots of people raising questions. So Bernice, are you asking a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but go ahead and ask. I can hear you. It's oral Torah.
It's dark in my room, so I wanted to ask you about Lilith. You know, I hear that did Lilith come before or after Eve, or who is she in the story?
Okay, so Lilith is not in the Bible. Lilith is a creation of the Midrash and the mystical tradition later. There are two creation stories in the Bible, chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis. They are they tell the same story of how the world got created, but in very different ways. And there's some big divergences between them. One of the differences between chapter 1 and chapter 2 is that in chapter 1, male and female are created together and blessed together. In chapter 2, man is created, he's lonely, so woman is created for him. Okay? Two very different ideas of male-female relationships. Okay? You can think of lots of ways to reconcile these. Frankly, they're both true, right? We are equal, but we're not the same. And in what way are we equal and in what way are we not the same is something that's being fought out to this very day in the United States Supreme Court and everywhere else, right? So what the Midrash did in order to try to reconcile these two stories is they took a mythical creature that had already been well known in the ancient Near East, and they made up this wonderful story that in chapter 1, man was created with a companion who was his equal. Lilith was his equal. And Lilith demanded to be his equal in all things. And because Lilith demanded to be his equal in all things, right? Adam was angry and offended, and they fought like hell. And God says, I can't have a world where there's this kind of discord. So God sent Lilith into exile, and now man was alone. That's now where chapter 2 begins. And so he creates Eve. And Eve is his, second companion. And she is different than Lilith because she's created from him. And therefore, they have a different relationship. In some stories, Eve is more submissive, and that's why man loves her. And in some stories, Eve is simply different because she comes from man and can communicate with him in a different way. And so there's this whole tradition of Lilith as the woman who wouldn't submit, who wouldn't be less than equal to man. So when feminism rose in the 1970s, Lilith becomes, from a demon, she becomes a hero. She becomes a great hero because she's the woman who wouldn't be put down. And that's there's a long story about myth. There's many more stories of the myth of Lilith, but that's a basic thumbnail story of the myth of Lilith.
Thank you very much. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
that explanation.
There you go. Well,
Because
I want to wish
know
every
there was
yes.
a magazine called Lilith at one point.
Because it was a feminist magazine started by
now that makes sense.
Pogreben, and it was a wonderful it is a wonderful, it's still there. It's a wonderful magazine because she becomes the hero because she's a woman who wanted to be man's equal and not submissive to him in any way.
That
All
makes
right,
a lot of sense now. Thank you.
Sure. Nothing makes sense, but that's
no, the fact that for women's feminism.
Right. All right, everyone. Let me wish you a very happy, healthy Pesach. Thank you for coming on tonight. And I hope everyone's taking very good care. We'll see next week, Pesach prep, and then we'll take a week off and we'll return on Tuesday nights for the Holocaust and its meaning, and then the state of Israel and its meaning. And we'll continue our exploration of the questions that won't go away. Thank you for listening.